Why are you cockeyed?
Ah, well, this is part of an experiment of seeing if we can get a landscape view on the phone. So I'm seeing myself level, but I'm seeing you sideways and you're seeing me sideways. This is part of the learning experience. I'm so sorry, Pat.
No, I'm fine. It's just like, I thought it was something artistic. What did I know? You know,
Yes, right.
I never know. I'm not artistic. You are. So.
Oh, sure. No, you're very artistic. Should we just turn it now, you think?
How about I do that?
Oh, that's fantastic.
Okay, let me unplug my computer so I can like not kill my computer while I do this.
But if people are watching from a desktop,
But oh yes, but you know, if people are watching from a desktop, they're not going to be able to make that adjustment. So
Well,
I'm thinking I should rotate our camera before we get started. So many things to learn in this wonderful age of internet. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm working at cross purposes with you here, but I realize if other people join, then they would have the same problem you had, and they might not be able to fix it. So let me see what that does.
I just thought it was something an artistic thing for you. So I mean, I just didn't even really.
Right. Watch me for an hour at 90 degrees. Sure. All right. Let's get started. Welcome, one and all. And this is Worse. Stories of strength and resilience from the old days. Times are tough, but we'll get through this. We've been through worse. Leading off tonight, I think of the bomber jacket. Think of the classic coat that people wear when they fly in airplanes, and the fact that our image of an old-fashioned aviator is one who is wearing a scarf. And ask yourself why that is. Well, that leads us to our first segment, which is called motion discomfort. The aviation pioneers that helped to get us to the marvels of flight that we now enjoy went through a lot of uncomfortable stuff to make it happen. I'm going to be tonight having a piece of salmon cooked on the fire with some pickles from our local Boonton Farmers Market, and I'm drinking a Bell's Two-Hearted Ale. They are not a sponsor. We don't have sponsors yet, but this is from Comstock, Michigan, and it came recommended. All right. So one of the early pioneers of aviation, there are names that we all know, Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, but there was somebody named Alexander Pearson, who he was a World War I pilot, and then he helped move the field forward after that. In those days, airplanes were part of the Army Air Corps. There's not an Air Force yet. And one of the ways the Army developed people's skills was to, oh, hold on just a moment. One of the ways that the Army cultivated people's flying skills was to have transcontinental competitions. And it was so interesting, us living in the age of GPS, that the way Alexander Pearson found his way across the country was that he bought a railroad map, and he would look out the side of his plane and follow the railroad tracks to get from one place to another. It's so quaint almost, but when you think that he was flying in the air with only a machine holding him up, it's a pretty amazing thing. After he was part of some of these competitions, he worked in the border patrol, protecting the country from what they characterized as bandits and cattle rustlers. And it was an interesting intersection of two areas of technology, because he would fly along the border looking for these rustlers and bandits. And if he saw one, he would report them to the local cavalry post. He was flying a plane and he was reporting it to the cavalry. It's so interesting, a sense of bridging the 19th and 20th centuries. Then there was a competition he flew in later that went from Florida to San Diego. These people were so willing and able to go by the seat of their pants, fly by the seat of their pants. I think that's probably where we get the expression. At the last minute, he made a modification to his plane so that he could move the fuel tanks up to the front. I'm not clear on what the reason was, but what that meant was taking out the front seat of the plane, moving all the instruments back and flying the plane from the back seat. And this is something he did before he flew from Florida to California. On this flight, his plane had engine trouble in the Texas desert. He had a forced landing in Mexico on the south on the Rio Grande. And he waited until the water in his engine cooled so that he could drink it to keep himself alive, drinking out of his engine. He took off on foot. He was 3 days without food until he met some beaver trappers, which is very strange to me that beavers could live in that arid environment, who fed him and gave him a burro that he could ride to civilization. Now, Amelia Earhart perhaps had it a little bit easier, but there's still some really, really primitive things she had to contend with. Her famous solo flight across the Atlantic was in 1933. What I didn't know is that she was the first person, male or female, to fly solo across the Atlantic since Lindbergh. There had been other flights, but it was with multiple crewmen. So she was 5 years after Lindbergh. She did it alone. She flew a Lockheed Vega, smart looking plane. It was red. I've looked at pictures of it. And one of the things that strikes me is looking at photographs of the cockpit. We think of a cockpit as being full of gauges and instruments, controls, dials. This looked like somebody started to build a cockpit and then just lost interest. There were a few instruments clustered in the center, lots and lots of open fuselage with apparently no insulation, and then a couple of pedals and the yoke, the thing you hold on to. So it helped me to understand, looking at the inside of that plane, why the classic old-time aviator would wear what we would call now a bomber jacket. And of course, that expression comes from what people would wear flying bombing missions in World War II, and the scarf. You can see why they were so cold. So Lindbergh got to start flying airmail between St. Louis and Chicago. And as one writer put it, that's where he got his first experience with poor weather, nighttime flying, and fatigue. I love that. I love that description. Two different accounts of his famous transatlantic flight said that at some points he flew very, very low, close to the water, in the hope that the sea spray would hit him in the face and keep him awake. He was, unlike Amelia Earhart, who seemed to be able to do it pretty quickly, 15 hours or so. Lindbergh took 33 and a half, and that's on top of a lot of time that he was awake prior to that, getting his plane ready. So he was just full on hallucinating from lack of sleep. He was seeing phantom figures in the cockpit next to him, saying things to him. He was seeing islands out ahead of him on the ocean that weren't actually there. One thing he did was really smart, and this might shed some light on why his flight took so long. Some of these other people who flew across the Atlantic or attempted to do so went from a desolate, godforsaken place to another desolate, godforsaken place because they were the closest points on the two continents. One guy, for example, flew from Newfoundland and then landed in a peat bog in Ireland. So as you can imagine, he didn't get as much press. Lindbergh flew from New York City to Paris. Very smart move. Looking back on what these people did, I'm reminded of the phrase, the first layer of fatigue. It's something from William James, the philosopher and psychologist from the early 20th century, who said that most people, when they hit the first layer of fatigue, they stop. And we live most of our life underneath the first layer of fatigue. But if you push through, you discover reserves of strength and energy you didn't know you had. So I'm very glad that these early pioneers pushed through that first layer of fatigue. So let's jump ahead a little bit. Chuck Yeager, he was a West Virginian, first person to break the sound barrier, which was named that because they were under the impression that it literally might be physically impossible to fly faster than sound. Chuck Yeager is the one who proved that was wrong. He flew a Bell X-1, which was launched from a B-29 Superfortress that had its bomb bay specially modified to hold the thing. But here's the thing. This little Bell X-1 jet plane did not fit in the bomb bay of the Superfortress. It fit partly in and partly underneath. So when they took off for these flights, Yeager would sit on an apple crate next to the pilot of the Superfortress. When they got to the right height and location and speed, he and an engineer assisting him would go down by a ladder into 250-mile-per-hour winds in the open bomb bay where it was 0 degrees. And but there was a shield to protect them from the wind. Isn't that thoughtful? So Jaeger would climb into this little hatch, which was basically the size of an oven door. And then another flight guy would lower the hatch down, and the engineer and Jaeger would maneuver it into position. It wasn't on hinges. It was just like a hatch they had to stick in there and then bolt down. So on the day that he made his historic flight where he broke the sound barrier, he had broken a couple of ribs horseback riding the day before. And so they gave him a sawed-off broom handle to make it easier for him to lever this hatch into place before his historic flight. Also, in some of these flights, the windscreen, or the canopy as they called it, iced over so badly that he had to be talked down by a following plane to land the plane blind. So subsequent to that, what they did was they smeared shampoo on the inside of the canopy because that prevented it from freezing up. These primitive workaday solutions to these historic, technologically advanced flights are just so interesting. I thank all those people for pushing through the first layer of fatigue, and I hope in these tough times we find the same strength. I think I'm going to put my salmon on. This is my first time cooking a salmon directly over flames, so we will have to see how this goes. Anyway, the beer and the pickles will be good. The salmon might be cooked, burned to a crisp. In 1963, the South Australian Spearfishing Championship was held about 50 miles south of Adelaide, Australia, and the defending champion was a guy named Rodney Fox. He had won the previous year. These competitions required no small amount of skill because in addition to their spear gun, the competitors had simply a bathing suit, a weight belt to help keep them down, swim flippers, and a mask and snorkel. They did not have scuba tanks. So Rodney had gotten well accustomed to the cold water and he was very acclimated to it. He was about 40 feet down and he just spied a large fish that he wanted to spear. And then he said, suddenly it seemed that everything went quiet. And the next thing he knew, he was moving very quickly sideways through the water. His mask was gone and his spear gun had been knocked out of his hand. He managed to twist around and look behind him and he could see an enormous tail. And that's when he realized he was in the mouth of a great white shark. It had hit him on his left side. I encourage you to Google him and to see pictures of his injuries. They are astonishing. Apparently he was reaching forward as if in a swimming stroke at the moment when the shark hit him. And there were enormous perforations starting at his bicep, going across his chest, all the way down to his pelvis and up the back. That was the size of the shark's mouth. He managed to twist around and poke the shark in the eye with his other hand, and the shark let him go. So he swam to the surface and was able to get a breath because at that point he was suffocating, basically drowning, and the shark's teeth had also perforated his lung. He said that the most terrifying thing he has ever seen, this phrase I will never forget, was the conical head of the shark rising at him through a pink cloud of his own blood. And then the first lucky thing happened in this extremely unlucky series of events. The shark decided to go for one of the speared fish that Rodney was carrying on a rope that was attached to his weight belt. I guess that's how the competitors kept the fish they caught. The problem was that when the shark grabbed that and then submerged again, Rodney was dragged under. So once again, he was at risk of drowning. He tried to get the weight belt to release, but his hands didn't work anymore because at one point he had tried to punch the shark when it came to the surface, and his other hand, the one that hadn't been previously damaged, got all lacerated in the shark's mouth. So he wasn't able to release his weight belt. And then the second lucky thing happened, which was that the shark's teeth severed the rope. So he was able to swim to the surface, call for help, although how you call for help under those circumstances, I do not know. A boat happened to be nearby, got him to a hospital. He got, let's get this number right, 462 stitches in his torso, 92 in his right hand and arm. And it's believed that no one else has ever survived injuries that severe from a shark attack. So I read this back in the mid-1970s. After Jaws came out, there was a craze of sharks, shark books, shark movies, shark documentaries. That was probably the genesis of Shark Week on the Discovery Channel, although I'm not sure about that. But I read this book called Shark Attack by David Baldridge, who was a guy with the US Navy who gathered accounts of shark attacks. And what I didn't know from that book was something I read on Rodney Fox's website, that as he recovered from his injuries, he began scuba diving again in a lake near his house. He wasn't ready to go back in the ocean. After I saw Jaws, I was scared to go in a swimming pool. So he practiced in this freshwater lake, but the following year, he entered the Australia Spearfishing Championships in Victoria, and he scored top score in 3 out of 4 events. That is a guy you can't keep down. That is absolutely astonishing to me. Oh, and by the way, he is the person who invented the idea of going down in a shark cage and then attracting great white sharks with bait so that people can look at them and take photographs of them. That's what he does for a living now. Very interesting guy. Okay, we began last week the story of the Siege of Malta, which I wanted to share with you because it's one of the most astounding stories of human endurance on part of both the attackers and the defenders that I have ever read. And I first became aware of it in a book called Empires of the Sea by Roger Crowley. The Siege of Malta happened in 1565. There was another one in World War II, but we're not talking about that. 1565, where we are in our story is that the Ottoman Turks had been expanding their empire and pushing westward into Europe for a century. And now they struck at an island that is almost literally in the middle of the Mediterranean, Malta. So they arrived with a force between 24 and 30,000 men. Opposing them are the Knights of Malta. There were maybe 500 in total, led by an old knight named Jean Perisseau de La Valette, and a force of native Maltese and volunteers from all over Europe, about 8,000 defenders in total. So the Ottoman general, Mustafa Pasha, knew that if he failed to conquer the island, when he got back to the Ottoman capital, Istanbul, the Sultan would probably cut off his head. One time the Sultan beheaded a guy for failing in a mission when the guy was 90 years old. So there is no reason that Mustafa Pasha should expect any mercy from his boss if he came back as a failure. Now, on the defender's part, La Valette, the leader of the Knights, knew that the order to which he'd given his life would probably be swept away forever if they lost their island home. They'd already been driven out of the Holy Land 100 years previously and were just hanging on by creating this new identity on this one island. So those are the stakes. So the first big battle is over for the tiny fort of St. Elmo, which the Ottomans did conquer, but at an enormous cost in terms of men. And now they are turning their attention to the 2 big towns surrounding the harbor in Malta, Birgu and Sanglia. Now that battle is beginning. So one huge element in this siege, since I said there are only about 500 knights, was the native Maltese population. They were an interesting sort. They were an ethnic mix of people from all over the Mediterranean. Malta had been invaded by people going all the way back to the Phoenicians, and they were this ethnic hybrid of people from all around the Mediterranean basin. And even though they were Roman Catholic, in their native Maltese language, their word for God was Allah. So La Valette, the leader of the Knights, thought that they were of little use. They would run away at the first whiff of gunpowder. He was wrong. On July 15th, the Ottomans tried a combined attack by sea and land to overwhelm the outnumbered defenders. And this was a basic tactic the Ottomans used again and again, especially with numerically inferior defenders. Attack all points at once, assuming they cannot defend them all at once. They attacked both towns, Birgu and Sanglia, from both land and sea, and it might have succeeded, but they missed a key detail. There was a fort on a point of land in one of the towns, very low, close to the waterline, that had cannon in it, and the Ottomans didn't see it. So they came around this point. This was their masterstroke. 10 ships filled with their best troops. So when the battle was at its height, suddenly these 10 troops are going to come to a key weak point and attack. And as they came around this point of land, the guy who commanded this little fort realized that the Ottomans had no idea he was there. So very, very quietly, he instructed his men to fill their cannon with things that were designed to do maximum damage to ships densely packed with men, like not cannonballs, pieces of chain, bags of small stones. And they waited until the Ottoman ships were so close that they couldn't miss, and then they opened fire. And in 2 salvos, they sank 9 out of 10 of the ships. So this, which was intended to be Mustafa Pasha's masterstroke, fizzled out. And as Crowley said, at a stroke, hundreds of his best troops were floating dead in the water. So that attack collapsed. But as became clear over and over throughout history, the tough-minded Ottomans were not shattered by shattering defeats. They came back again and again and again. There were 10 major assaults on these 2 towns during the summer of 1565 and into September. And usually they were preceded by a bombardment to weaken up the defenders. And sometimes there would be false alarms, false bombardments that didn't lead to attacks, designed to make the defenders exhausted and staggering on their feet in advance of the final push. So the defenders between these 2 towns on this harbor had strung a chain across so the Muslims couldn't get their ships in anymore. So the Muslims took little ships and dragged them overland to the inner side of this harbor so they could still do an amphibious attack. And they got a lot of ships, and then they built the sides up so the men would be better protected. On August 7th, another massive attack happened, following a sustained bombardment that breached the walls. And messengers came to Lavalette saying the Turks are inside the town. He had already been injured in an earlier fight, and he hobbled there as quickly as he could. But just when it seemed that it was all over, mysteriously and unexpectedly, the attackers began to retreat, and the attack collapsed. What had happened was there was a town in the center of the island called Medina. It was not a port, it was miles inland, that the Ottomans had given very little thought to. And there was a small garrison there that Lavalette had put up there, including some cavalry. So while this attack was at its height and the Ottoman camp a few miles away was basically empty of everyone except the wounded, 100 horsemen from Medina came in, burned the tents, killed the wounded, destroyed the supplies. And all the attackers involved in this giant assault looked back and saw their camp on fire. And they thought, oh no, Christian reinforcements have arrived from the mainland, and they all ran away. Mustafa Pasha was furious. He was hitting men with whips. He was offering to lead the attacks in person if they would just stop retreating, but a madness had taken hold of them, and that attack too collapsed. There was another time they couldn't get it. They were tunneling under the walls, and by purely poor luck, the Ottomans doing the tunneling stuck a spear up to see how deep they were underground in the soft earth, and somebody on the wall saw the spear point stick up out of the ground. So they dug the countermine, broke in, killed the miners, and collapsed the tunnel. This was an epic struggle of endurance and a sort of a last man standing thing between two major powers in the Mediterranean in this era. And in a twist worthy of Mel Brooks, in late August, on top of the misery, the sickness, the death, the destruction, it started to rain. To be continued. So I want to jump ahead for the last story tonight to the Great Chicago Fire. I'm bringing it back to America. This is a story that's interesting for a couple of ways. Let me tell you the story you may know, but I hope you don't know all the details while I get my salmon and see if it's actually ready to be eaten. And then I'm going to give a perspective for you that I find very, very hopeful. So the Great Chicago Fire happened in 1871. And the classic myth about it is that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern in the barn, a kerosene lantern, set fire to the barn, set fire to the neighboring buildings, and then the fire spread across Chicago. This is the myth. But what we do know is that somewhere in the vicinity of the O'Leary farm, and there were farms within the Chicago city limits at this time, a fire started. It was on the southwest side of the city, and there was a strong southwesterly wind blowing that day. So that was a disastrous combination. Not to mention that Chicago had grown so quickly, more on that later, that the most of the buildings were wooden. So it was a tinderbox waiting to happen. Many first-person accounts survived, often in the forms of letters to distant relatives, and they sketch in really touching details about this fire that burned a 4 mile by 1 mile area. 4 square miles of the city burned. Hundreds of people died. 100,000 were homeless, and it took a day and a half to get it under control. When it finally happened through a combination of the work of firefighters, rain, and the military coming in to help. So really, over and over again, a pattern you see is that the people see the fire at a distance. They go up on their roof. They look at that interesting thing happening, that red glow on the horizon. They go to bed, and several hours later, they're awakened by somebody that's saying, "We got to get out of here. The fire is 2 blocks away." This happened over and over. Sometimes people would flee their house, go someplace safe, then get woken up a few hours later. We're in danger now. The fire has reached us. There was one guy who worked for a bank. I thought this was so interesting because most of the downtown burned. The banks, the post office, most of the commercial district. He worked for the Commercial National Bank. The building burned. He was called into work, and the boss handed out pistols to all the employees because now their vault was there, didn't burn, amid the charred ruins of the building that had been the bank. So it's just a vault sitting there out in the open. And looters and thieves had gotten very, very busy when all of this happened. So, but now let me back up the camera for you. In a couple minutes left to us. In 1800, New York City was 176 years old. The Revolutionary War had been fought and won. Chicago didn't exist yet. Okay. Few years later, the Louisiana Purchase happens. The U.S. doubles its size, settlement accelerates in the middle of the continent. So by 1825, Chicago still did not exist. Detroit existed. Hell, Los Angeles existed. There was still no Chicago. 1833, it was incorporated as a town because there were 12 families living there by where the river met the lake. A few years later, it was incorporated as a city. By the time of the fire, there were 324,000 people in the city. And despite the setback and the fact that 100,000 people were homeless, by 1880, its population was 500,000. And by 1900, it was the 5th largest city on earth. And the only one of the top five, that did not exist 100 years previously. Guess you can't keep a good town down. Thanks for joining me. I hope you found some excitement, some interest, and some hope in these stories from worse. Tales of strength and inspiration from the old days. Things are hard right now, but we'll get through this. We've been through worse. Thanks for joining us.